Hi, I'm Sally Medding. This is part 2 of a 5-part video series for those who have never painted in watercolor before. Part 1 covered brush handling, water to pigment ratios, and how to create light, medium and dark values as a small wash. This video will cover other common techniques, and I'll start with wet in wet. First, I'm going to talk about which brushes I'm going to use for this wet in wet. The last video I talked about using my round brush, but in this one I want to cover a larger area faster, so I'll be using a flat brush. And for very large areas you can use a much bigger one. First of all, I'm going to do wet on dry, just to remind you from the previous video, but the technique will be the same as the wet in wet, but first of all you have to wet the paper. So I'm just wetting the paper here with some color so that you can see how to do it with a flat brush as opposed to the previous video which was a round brush. I'm picking up the bead at the base of the paper. So now I'm going to rinse my brush. That was phthalo blue green shade, and I need the same, no, I need clean water. So here, clean water. And I'm going to wet my paper, but you can't see it, so it's that same technique below, but I'm just wetting it because we can't do a technique without it being wet. So that's super wet. Maybe you can see a shiny bead at the bottom there. I'm going to pick that up, and now I'm going to drop in colors into my wet paper. So I'll start off with, let's just try some red to begin with, and it's a middle concentration, just a mid-tone. I'm just going to drop some colors in, and you'll watch it just sort of explode out, and the more you put in, the more it will start to flow out. It creates these beautiful effects, but they tend to mingle into this effect disappears. They tend to mingle into the paper once they're dry. I'm just picking up that bead so it's not so saturated. And these are running beautifully now, and this can create all sorts of lovely effects. So now I'm going to add another color. I'm just going to add some yellow and put that over here close by. And again, you can see, but it doesn't have the same effect as the red. It doesn't create quite, the chemistry between them is different. So what I'm doing now is actually mingling the colors on the paper. And of course I'm going to create an orange. Now we're going to go back to the wet on dry square that we did prior to the wet in wet. And what I want to do is wet on dry on top of another dry square, and I'll show you why. So I'm going to use a different color. I'll use some permanent rose this time and make up that middle milky 2% mix about. I don't want it too concentrated for a glaze, as now what it's called. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to offset another square on top of this one, and you will see that I'm creating in between a nice purple. So you can see the two separate colors, but together you see the veils of color. Your eyes are looking through the pink to the blue to the white of the paper, and then the light is bouncing back into your eyes, and hence the reason that you see this glowing effect. Now we're going to do dry on dry, and the brush actually won't be completely dry, it will be damp. So you would wet it, take off the excess, pat it on a tissue to make it thirsty. That's about the amount of moisture we're going to be needing. So first off I need to wet it a bit so I can pick up some paint. And I need to make up a pretty thick mixture. This is phthalo blue green shade. I'm going to tap it a couple of times. I'm going to hold it in an overhand position like this so that I can use the belly of the brush, and I'm going to do a fast stroke scraping across the tops of the paper to create this dry brush effect. And it can emulate the feeling of waves, water, depending on the pigment that you use and obviously the amount of mixture you use. The next technique is dry on wet or dry in wet, and there are several things that you can actually do that will work for adding dry items into a wet wash. You could use salt, you can scratch it, you can use your fingernails, you can use a metal tool. These are all dry objects which we're going to actually scratch into something wet. So first off, I'm going to create a little wash in a violet, just for a change, and bringing it down the page, creating a little square, and pat it dry so that I can pick up my bead. And now I'm going to add some salt. This is just sea salt, and it's got a grinder, and I'm literally going to grind it into my painting. Add some condiments. I don't need quite that much salt, but just a few granules will work. And you'll see that they'll go dark immediately when you add it. If they don't, that means your wash was too dry. And what's happening now is the salt is picking up the pigment. It's going to make it into salty water and pigment, and then it's going to dissolve, and that will push out and create some interesting patterns. The next one is called graffito, but the S is actually silent. It's an Italian word meaning to scratch. So I'm going to do another purple swatch here, just really fast. Putting down my wash. And this is a bit of a waiting game. So you can scratch it when, this is a piece of credit card I'm using. I've just cut it up and I've got a scratchy tool. If I scratch it with something hard, or here this is a bookbinder's awl, or you could use a darning needle, it makes really nice dark washes. You're making a furrow in the paper, and then the pigment is going into that furrow. It is actually damaging the paper. And then you can also do, if you wait long enough, it's probably been about 30 seconds, and if you do it fast, hold on, you can make a white one, because you're actually swishing out the paper out of the way, and this can make really nice grasses effects, and you'll get some light ones and some dark ones. Now we're going to talk about lifting out and masking, and they're somewhat related because we're trying to either protect the white of our paper, which is the function of masking, or lifting out, where we're actually lifting out the color from the paper. So first of all, I'm going to show you how I do the masking, and I'm using a very old brush. It's lost its paint already, and I'm going to wet it, and I'm going to protect it with hand soap. This is just ivory soap, or I don't know, can't remember. Something nice, and I'm going to sort of roll it in my hand to make sure that it's really in the bristles. And now I can put out a little drop of masking fluid, and this masking fluid is from Richardson Mediums. It's the Shiva series, and it's called Liquid Mask. And it's liquid latex in a dilute ammonia solution, as are all masks. And mine happens to have a slightly pinkish look to it. Some of them are green, some are grey, it all depends. So now I've got soap in my brush, and I'm going to dip that in, and I am literally going to coat my little square here. Just fairly liberally coat it, and then I need to wash my brush out fairly quickly, otherwise it's going to dry in there and be as hard as bubble gum in your hair. So I'm going to wash it out in my bucket of water, and then I have to let that dry. Right now it's kind of shiny wet, but after a while it will become darker. You can see the difference in the lid here. This one is darker. That's fresh, which I just used. This is one that's dried, and literally it is a piece of latex. And that's what's going to happen on the paper. This is very light pink right now. It will go darker, but it'll still remain a little tacky. It won't be completely dry. And then this piece of tape here is just painter's tape from any hardware store, and it is going to protect the paper too. I just cut a square, and I'm going to sort of burnish over it with the back of my thumb to make sure that it's really well adhered to the paper. And then underneath I have one which is already dry, and you can probably see the difference in the masking now. This one I can touch, it doesn't come off on my hands. This one does. Yeah, it's almost dry already. So then I'm going to paint a colour over the top of these, and this will protect my paper underneath. And depending on how large your area is, this is obviously meant for larger areas. This you can do for the white of an eye or something like that. Now we're actually going to do the lifting out part, showing with a wet wash, showing how you actually can lift with a dry brush. But I changed my water first because it had the soap and the latex in it, so I didn't want to leave that in there. Now I've made up a mix, a milky mix of ultramarine turquoise from Daniel Smith, and this is burnt sienna from Holbein. And this one I've chosen because it's very staining, like any phthalo. This has got phthalo green in it. This is a mixture of phthalo green and French ultramarine blue, and they call it ultramarine turquoise. But it's the phthalo green that's going to be staining my paper, which makes it harder to lift out, so I wanted to show you that. And burnt sienna is a non-staining, and you'll be able to see I can lift the white of the paper. So what I'm going to do now is just create a little wash over the top of here. Need a little more water over the top. And then I'm going to transition. I'm going right over my mask, transition, and down here I'm getting into burnt sienna, and I want it completely clean burnt sienna now. So we've got all of the combinations in there. So now I'm going to wash out my brush as thoroughly as I can and make it somewhat thirsty. And I'm going to do a lift while it's at this wet damp stage. So I'm going to lift right through it. And sometimes you have to do it more than once. And it's lifting quite nicely. So depending on where it is in terms of wetness as to how well it will lift. And it looks like my phthalo actually didn't do too badly. Oftentimes it will leave a stain behind, but I did it quickly enough that it didn't even have time to stain the paper. So you'll really see the difference when I come to dry this. And so I'll go and dry it with a hairdryer, and when I come back we'll do it then without it being wet, and you'll see there's a big difference between the two. Not quite so much right now. And you can see I've got paint left on the top of these. Don't worry about that, that will dry. But if you want to lift off this mask now to get back to this lovely white square under here and under here, this wash here needs to be completely dry. So I'm going to stop for a second and dry it briefly with the hairdryer. Now that my wash is dry, I want to show you the difference with the lifting technique. So I'm going to lift it now with cleanish water. So if I brush over it, nothing happens. But if I brush over it a second time, I'll start to lift some colour. Slowly, slowly working my way into lifting this. And then I can actually blot with a tissue as well. Not a very clean one. So still not looking fabulous, but it is definitely lifting more at this end. I've been lifting, bringing the staining colour through. So that is one way of lifting. There, if you can see that that maybe is a little bit lighter than this, which clearly is very stained with the ultramarine turquoise. Compared with that one, you can see the colour started to flood back in. But I was just lifting with a soft brush. If I now go to using a level lifter, and that's a brush that's got very short bristles, but lots of them. This is one from Cheap Joe's. I'm going to wet it, but bang off the excess. I can actually rub my painting and blot and get back to a lot lighter. Obviously not all the way back to white, but I can get back to white pretty close with my level lifter. So the last part I want to show you is lifting out these bits, and this is always kind of fun because there's my beautiful white square, and now you see that the lifting isn't really that white. And then this one with the masking fluid, and I'm using a natural rubber pickup, which is just a block of rubber, and I'm just going to push that on the corners, and this has to be bone dry to do this, and then you can literally peel off the masking fluid. I tend to pull at a 45-degree angle because sometimes it can tear the paper. Now we're doing spattering as our last technique, and I have 3 different ways in which I do that. The first one is what I call the drumstick method. The second one I call is swish and flick, which is kind of a Harry Potter move. And then the last one is done with an old toothbrush that's been through the dishwasher. So the first one is a drumstick, and I'm just going to use my flat brush, but this is the drumstick if you like. And I've just got some permanent rose that I've picked up as a milky mixture. I don't want it to be too soggy because I don't want it to spat everywhere. And then I'm going to hold this about an inch over where I'm wanting it to actually land. And I'm going to tap gently in the area that I want it. And you need to be sure you're tapping on your drumstick, because if you do it the other way around, that's going to flick it right in your face. So this is the drumstick method and gives a very even sized dot. So the second method that I use is the Harry Potter, and it is literally a swish and a flick, and I'm going to it's easier to just demo it. I'm going to be bringing my brush down really fast and breaking and flicking at the end. So there's a swish and then there's a flick, as if you're throwing a ball through the palette. So I'm going to practice on my palette, don't need my drumstick now. And that's the technique. So I usually practice on my palette because this one is definitely more of a splat than a spat. So I'm going to now, I think I've got some reason, but you can see it's making much more of a actual, the splat has made little mini ones around it. So this one you do need to be careful that you don't get it on everything else or your neighbor's work or what have you. So you can actually mask your area to make sure that you don't get it. Yeah, now it can be a little bit more sloppy. And the last technique is doing this technique with a toothbrush, a very old toothbrush, and you can even use a little mask. I cut a little something that resembles a rock here. I'm going to load up my brush with, this is burnt sienna. I'm going to make sure it's not too soaking wet, and using the back side of a ruler I am going to push into the paper that way. If you pull this way you're going to get it in your face, and I'm doing it on a ruler because that could prevent any big drops if you've got your brush overloaded, and that often happens. So I'm going to do a very fine spatter, and I don't know how well you'll be able to see this, but this is great for sand texture, for rocks. And then when you pull, so that's another way of doing masking, just with a piece of paper. So there's your rock shape. So 3 different types of spatter, and all for different reasons and different applications. So to wrap up, we've seen all of these 7 techniques, and now I want to show you some of these techniques as examples in paintings. So this was the wet in wet, charging in colors while each color previously was still wet. And this is the wet on dry techniques to create the little house down below. Then we have masking, and this was done over the trunks of the trees. And then the mask was peeled off and left the white trunks, and then I used dry brush to create the interesting effect that birch trees seem to have. There's spattering below here that gives it a nice painterly feel. So I think that's all of the techniques on that one. And then this is salt that you saw before, the smaller and bigger salt. And then glazing was done over the top of the shadow part of this leaf. So that's again wet on dry, but layering on top of each other. And then this one is showing some lifting out, but it's a slightly different kind of lifting out. This is lifting out done with something I found lying around the house, and I did a little texture here and rubbed it with a brush and blotted it quickly, and it gave me some detail looking like this little Asian bowl. And this is wet and wet up here on the edge of the parrot tulips, and there's some spattering down here, so I can get some of those colors down there as well. It helps with unity of the painting. And then here we've got masking. and masking done with masking fluid as the actual spatter. So here I would have spattered on the spray, then rubbed it all off, so I protected the whites while I painted the rest of the painting. And then I created a mask for the shape of the rocks, and then I spattered on the colors in the browns and the reds and so forth to create the texture of the rocks. And the final one, which you've seen before, is lifting out the breezeways on reflections, and that about wraps it up. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something, and if you like my video and want to see more, please consider donating to Patreon at the link below. If you'd like to see some of my artwork, check out my website at the link above, and if you have any questions, please contact me at sallymetting@gmail.com.